Gotta tell you something. I never played Atlas. I know, crazy, but it is what it is. However, with the recent Warframe update, Atlas got reworked, and let me tell you, he is absolutely insane now. So, you know the deal, we're gonna talk about him today, skills, builds, how to play the whole broadside so that you can deal some of those juicy tens of millions of damage yourself. Big shoutouts to all our generous channel members who helped me keep the lights on, and now let's jump right into it. Alright, you know the drill, we haven't ever talked about Atlas on this channel, so let's delve into his full kit, talking about his passive and all the abilities. First of all, his passive is relatively simple. As long as you're standing on the ground, meaning you're not in the air, you are immune to knockdown, which is very convenient because it means you do not need Prime Sure-Footed in the Excellence slot. However, the knockdown resistance is not the only feature of his passive. He also has a special resource called Rubble that you can find at the bottom right of the screen. Now, Rubble with Atlas is sort of a pickup similar to health and energy, and you can generate it with the rest of your kit. We're gonna talk about that in a second here. Just wanted to note that you can have a maximum of 1500 Rubble points, and for each Rubble point that you have, you get 1 armor, meaning with maximum Rubble, you will have a whopping 1500 bonus armor, which makes Atlas really darn tanky. Just note that your Rubble is also going to decrease again over time at a rate of 5 per second, meaning it will take quite a while until this thing fully runs out, making it very convenient to keep it at the maximum basically constantly. Now, his passive also has an augment, however, I'd rather not talk about it just yet, but instead I want to go over it talking about his first skill called Landslide. Now, Landslide is the bread and butter of Atlas's kit and basically his strongest ability by a long shot. What it does is, you quickly slide over to the enemy that you're aiming at, and you punch them in the face so hard that not only the enemy you're punching, but also all their friends around them get hit with big AoE damage. This Landslide ability, with the update, is now a moddable Exalted weapon, and we're gonna get into how to mod it in just a minute here. Just note that, like other Exalted weapons in the game, this also has its own combo counter, and it's really darn easy to get it up to the maximum because you gain 20 combo counter points every time you recast this ability, which, as you can also see, means you get up to 12x really fast. Now, there is a lot of in-detail information that needs to be said about this Exalted weapon, and we're going to talk about that in a minute here. Beforehand though, I wanted to mention that this has an augment called Path of Statues, which makes it that you leave behind a lingering field that when enemies walk into it, they get petrified, and this petrified status is exactly what you need to create the Rubble for your passive, because whenever you take out an enemy that is petrified, you generate Rubble pickups that will contribute to your Rubble meter in the bottom right of the screen. So on paper, this augment looks really nice, but in practice I actually find it pretty darn useless because that Rubble field is behind you, and when you slide forward to punch an enemy in the face, then you can expect that everything behind you is already dead. Therefore, it pretty rarely occurred to me that enemies actually ended up walking into this whole Rubble field, and I honestly do not think it's worth the mod slot. However, what is way more interesting here would be the augment for his passive called Rubble Heap, because what this makes is, when your Rubble meter is above 1400, so it's in the top 7.5%, your Landslide punches are completely free to cast, you don't need energy for them anymore, and they deal twice the damage and you slide twice as fast between enemies. This is a really strong augment that I use all the time, and I would definitely recommend it. Now, I do get that staying above 1400 Rubble sounds like it's going to be pretty tedious, but then again, your Rubble only decreases by 5 points per second, meaning all you really have to do to constantly keep this buff up is pick up Rubble pickup every 20 seconds, which honestly isn't all that difficult. Ability number 2 is called Tectonics, and this one, honestly, it's not all that useful. What you do here is you create a small protective barrier that does a whole lot of things, but I'm gonna keep it relatively oversimplified here because in practice it's really not all that good. Yes, you can use it if you are in a pinch and you really need to protect a certain defense target for just a couple more seconds, but this barrier doesn't have a lot of health, and if you ask me, his 2 would be an option to subsume over and use something else. Now, there's also an augment that allows you to create 3 of these walls. Might be nice in niche cases where you want to play Atlas in like a solo defense scenario, but in general, as I said, his second skill isn't all that useful on a day-to-day basis, meaning this augment is probably also not going to see a lot of use. Ability number 3 is called Petrify, and this is actually a relatively useful skill. What it does is it petrifies enemies in a cone in front of you, petrifying them, meaning they cannot move. They also become more susceptible to your damage, which is very nice. And of course, when you take them out, they will drop rubble, meaning this ability is your number 1 go-to to generate all the rubble that you need for your rubble meter. Now, there's also an augment here, which is relatively interesting because it makes that when you take out a petrified enemy, they will have an increased chance of dropping additional loot. This makes Atlas a very nice loot frame for resource farming, for example, but it is also helpful if you want to do a long survival mission or something, because more loot also means more life support drops. Just one thing to note here, this ability increases the chance that an enemy will drop loot. However, what it will not do is re-roll the entire loot, like Necros does, which means that if you're up against an enemy who has a guaranteed 100% chance to drop a certain item, like for example the Corpus Oxium Ospreys, which always drops 1 Oxium, then with Necros, you could make that enemy drop that guaranteed loot again. However, with Atlas's Orgaze, this would not work because it only increases the loot chance, and when the chance is already at 100%, you don't get any additional benefits. Nothing all too important in practice, just wanted to mention it. And finally, his 4th ability is called Rumblers, and at this point I really wish we could subsume 2 abilities because similar to your 2, also your 4 is not all that amazing, which also means I wanted to keep it a bit more simplified here. Now, long story short, what happens here is you create 2 stone buddies who run around on the battlefield and they do attack enemies. First of all, their damage is absolutely pathetic, so they're not gonna kill anything. And secondly, they're also relatively squishy compared to other types of summons, meaning they won't accompany you for all that long either. When they die, they do leave behind rubble for you, so that is certainly also a way to get it, albeit not the most energy efficient one. You could heal them by casting your 3 at them, and in general, the main benefit that they provide to you is that they just distract the enemies for a little bit, which can be nice at times. Now, Rumblers has 2 different augments. One of them is called Titanic Rumbler, which means instead of 2, you just get 1 Rumbler, which deals way more damage and has way more health and all that stuff. But in my opinion, even with that damage bonus, the Rumbler is still going to be useless. And then another one is called Rumbled, which turns you into a Rumbler, generating Overguard, which is kind of okay. You can certainly do that. I personally don't like it, but I'm not saying it's completely pointless. But, as always, if you could maybe leave a little like for the video, that would help me big time with the YouTube algorithm, so cheers so much for your support. But before we go into the Atlas build itself, and believe me, there is quite a lot to talk about, let's take a bit of a closer look at his Landslide, because this is quite the interesting exalted weapon. See, first of all, even though Landslide is technically a sort of melee weapon, it does have quite some quirks that sets it apart from other melees in the game. For example, the fact that this thing can only light attack. It cannot heavy attack, it cannot slam attack, it cannot do finishers, it can't do any of that. And that also means you cannot use Tennokai with this one. In fact, it doesn't even have a Exilus mod slot to put a Tennokai mod in. However, just like other exalted weapons, Landslide is of course now also fully moddable, and that means it does come with a melee arcane slot too. But before we go into how to mod Landslide itself, let's first take a quick look at its stats, which is actually pretty darn impressive. You have a base damage of 640, that being pure impact, especially given the fact that it comes with a whopping 35% base crit chance at a 2x multiplier, so you will deal quite some big numbers with it. Status chance, however, is at 15%. It's not terrible, you can definitely mod for it, but compared to something like Chromatic Blade from Excalibur, for example, right, you're not going to be dishing out tons of status effects left and right with this. But okay, so much for the base stats and the functionality. Let's now talk about the build, where the first thing I want to go into is the arcanes, and this to me was the biggest surprise of the entire video, and that would be that melee influence is not all that much better than other options. And the reason is that, as I previously explained in the ability section, when you use your Landslide, This has a moddable range, so your melee punches deal AoE damage to begin with, and that means if you mod enough range, then you already have crazy crowd clearing capabilities and you don't need melee influence to do that for you. So, which arcane should you use here? Well, first things first, since we have a very high base crit chance, we're not going to be in the yellow crits, that means melee duplicate is not going to happen here. Secondly, because Landslide can't do finishers, melee crescendo not only doesn't work, it doesn't even show up as an option to begin with. No, my personal preference would be melee influence if you go on a relatively low range build on Atlas. This way you ensure that you're still going to have the crowd clearing capabilities, but specifically against enemies that are weak to corrosive like Scalder or Grineer, I find that melee exposure is actually really darn strong, giving you that fat corrosive bonus damage, and it's gonna be pretty much up all the time because using Landslide is considered an ability cast, and therefore it refreshes constantly. Then I also tried out Melee Vortex, but similar to Melee Influence, also here I kind of found that it isn't all that amazingly strong because a melee weapon that has big range on its punches already, it doesn't really need to pull enemies in, at least if you build for enough range. And finally, and this is something that I would have never expected to like, but melee fortification, giving you plus 210 armor for 10 seconds on melee kill, is actually super darn strong if you consider how many melee kills you're actually going to be getting with Atlas. So you become much more survivable with all the additional armor that you're stacking, and if we're being fair, even without Arcane, the damage of Landslide is more than enough. But now that we've talked about the arcanes, how does the actual build on Landslide look like? And here we basically have two options. The first one is a crit status hybrid build, where you go for electricity as an element and then use melee influence to spread that. This is what I personally would recommend on builds that rock a relatively low range. And then the second build that you're seeing right here ditches the status chance and goes completely into as much base damage, elemental damage, everything that makes number go big. This is my preferred build right here, but you don't have to use melee exposure on this. This would also be the same build if you're going for melee fortification, for example. But now that we know everything about Landslide, let's now take a look at Atlas and how to build the man himself, starting out with a little discussion of survivability. See, Ash does have a shield, and that means that you can play him into shield gating if you absolutely want, similar to any other Warframe with a shield. And the positive thing here would be that while you are in your Landslide punching combo, you become completely invincible, similar to Excalibur /Dash. This definitely is an option, and if you'd like to go for it, then feel free to do so, but I still personally wouldn't recommend it because it is very stressful to play, and if you purely rely on shield gating and this invincibility, then one badly timed combo is already enough to completely knock you out of the boots. If you ask me, then Atlas is to be played as a pure health tank with a lot of health, a lot of armor, and adaptation, which neatly brings me over to the next point that I want to talk about, and that would be Umbral mods. See, on many Warframes, we tend to use at least one or maybe sometimes even two Umbral mods. However, Atlas is one of the very few frames out there who, in his ideal case, actually uses triple Umbral. The reason for that is that, as I previously said, Atlas is a health tank, so he really needs all of it. The health, the armor, and the ability strength, which, by the way, will be at a whopping 77% if you use triple Umbral. Only problem here being that with triple Umbral, you're probably going to have to invest 2 Umbral Forma if you want to craft a full build with maxed out mods, which is quite the hefty investment to make, and I'm sure that not everybody wants to do that. I personally also didn't want to, just wanted to mention, if you love Atlas, then yes, triple Umbral is, in my opinion, the best option. What if you don't want to go for triple Umbral? Then I would personally recommend going double Umbral with Vitality and Fiber, and instead of Umbral Intensify, you would go for Archon Intensify. And when it comes to Archon Intensify, there is a little bit of an extra info that I need to give you. As we all know, Archon Intensify gives you 30% strength, and then if you heal yourself by using abilities, you get another 30%, so ideally 60% ability strength. And the good thing here is that by collecting rubble from petrified enemies, you do heal yourself, and this does in fact trigger Archon Intensify. The only problem here though is that while you are in your Landslide combo, you are completely invincible, so you don't take damage. And just in case you were using the Guardian mod on your Sentinel, then the Sentinel would constantly refresh your shield, which means that you actually pretty rarely take damage to your health in the first place, and that means your Archon Intensify is not going to be up all the time. Now, does that mean this video is sponsored by Combat Discipline again? No, actually this time that does not mean we're going to use Combat Discipline. Would be kind of copium if you ask me. Instead, I would recommend if you actually go for Archon Intensify, then use the Decaying Dragon Key in your inventory to reduce your maximum shield and make your shield gating duration as low as possible. This way, you're making sure that your shield isn't that much of an obstacle and your health gets hurt earlier, and you also want to make sure that you do not use the Guardian mod on your Sentinel so your shield doesn't get constantly refreshed. If you do that, then your health will take enough damage that you can constantly heal it back up, and therefore Archon Intensify becomes a lot less cringe to play. Next, I want to talk about our helmet options, and here we actually have quite the selection. For example, and that's also what we're going to use today, Wrathful Advance, of course, giving you a whole ton of crit chance and making those big tier 3 red crits happen. However, that's not all. If you find that your personal Atlas setup struggles with the energy economy a little bit, then you can always go for Lycath's Hunt from Varuna. This will shower you in health orbs, which you can then turn into energy with Equilibrium. But you could also go for Nourish to not only help with the energy, but also give you viral damage on top. Definitely not a bad option. And finally, I also want to recommend Eclipse because this has two nice effects. On the one side, you can use the light version of it to increase your damage output, but you could also use the dark version to give you additional damage reduction. It becomes super duper ultra tanky, which might be helpful in higher level content, like for example the Temporal Archimedia, where enemy levels can go up into the 500s or so. Just one thing that I want to say here, in my personal opinion, when it comes to damage increase, then on Atlas, depending on which build you're running, Eclipse might actually be a better option than Roar. See, the damage that you're getting from Roar is considered faction damage bonus. That means it stacks with the faction damage that you mod onto Landslide. And in case you go for melee influence with electric damage over time, then this is the best option. However, if you, more like me, go for a flat damage approach where we're not going to deal damage over time, then you're actually going to deal more damage using Eclipse because Eclipse is its own multiplicative damage multiplier. Therefore, it stacks multiplicatively with everything else, making the overall damage output stronger if you already have faction damage modded onto Landslide, just to keep that in mind. But yeah, as I said, today we're going to use Wrathful Advance, that's my personal preference, so let's now finally take a look at the mods. Now, first off, I'm going to use the augment for his passive, Rubble Heap, because I really like the fact that you can instantly double your damage from Landslide with it, and it also helps with the energy because it makes Landslide effectively free to cast. Next, I want to talk about the aura, where, of course, you are free to use whatever you like, but I have two preferences here, and those would be either Growing Power to have more ability strength, which always comes in handy, or specifically if you're talking about a potential triple umbral setup, you might be a little low on mod capacity, and in this case, you could also go for Steel Charge. It is not going to have that much of a big impact on your damage, but if you just need that little bit of extra mod capacity, then I think it's still worth it. As for the rest of the build, I decided to prioritize duration because I find it really convenient if Wrathful Advance stays on for a little longer, so I went for Narrow-Minded as well as Primed Continuity. Then, in order to compensate for the reduced ability range from Narrow-Minded, I went for Cunning Drift as well as Overextended, which will put our total range at round about 140%. Now, when it comes to range on Atlas, then this is basically a preference thing. I've seen builds out there that go a lot into range where your punches have crazy AoE, and that's perfectly viable if you're into that. But the thing here is, if you go for too much range, then the AoE of your punches ends up being bigger than the range of your punches itself, which will effectively lead to a situation where you do one punch, then everybody around you is going to be dead, and you cannot chain up any further punches because there's no enemy left that you could actually slide to. On paper, this is of course very strong, and I can't deny that, but I personally feel it's just not as fun to play to just obliterate everything with one punch. I actually prefer to slide from A to B and chain together a nice combo. It just feels nicer to me. Just wanted to give you that information so you can decide for yourself if you rather want to go for a lot of range, or if you, just like me, prefer to keep it at around 140-150%, where you're gonna have nice AoE performance, but you still can chain together those combos. Next, in order to deal a lot of damage with those combos, we want to have a decent bit of ability strength, which is why we're going to go for Blind Rage, Umbral Intensify, and Mold Augmented. Just note here, ideally you would use Archon Intensify on this build, but because of the format situation on my Atlas, this kinda didn't work out, which meant I had to use the Umbral version here. For the energy economy, we go with Arcane Battery, giving us a whole lot of maximum energy based on our armor, which is going to be very high, and of course Equilibrium to fill up the juice. And one thing I do want to say here is that this build is more on the squishy side, because I didn't mod for armor and I didn't mod for health to make more space for the damage output and all the other mods. It's enough for base level Steel Path, but if you wanted to do Archimedia with it, then you would probably sacrifice one or two things here to go for more health and armor, maybe even Eclipse. And in that case, this right here would be the variant of the build. Just keep in mind, because we're already using 2 Umbral mods on this build, technically on this version of the build, going for triple Umbral would be the way to go, but again, my Atlas does not have the mod capacity for it. Now, let's also take a quick look at the Archon shards, where I personally would recommend to go for 2 yellows into more casting speed, because you're gonna spam your 3 quite a bit to petrify the enemies and generate all the rubble so that you can keep your armor bonus at a maximum of 1500, and that is just way more convenient with higher casting speeds. For the other 3 shards, you're pretty much free to use whatever you like. If you want to deal the maximum damage possible, then go for the purples that give you more melee crit damage, but you could also go for red shards into more ability strength and duration. And if you rather want to free up 1 arcane slot, you could use blue shards to increase your maximum energy, and therefore rather use another second arcane. In terms of weapons and companions, I think you're pretty free to use whatever you like because of the fact that you already have a decent AoE on your Landslide. That means you don't really have to go for Nautilus to group up the enemies. You're gonna be fine anyway. So I ended up preferring Diriga because Diriga has great status application, especially if you give him a weapon like the Tazikor, with which he can hit even more enemies than with just the skill alone. As for the weaponry, I would recommend going for some sort of status primer, maybe the Cedar with its alt fire, or something like the Kuvanukor or even Epitaph. All of this is fine, even explosive weapons, because of your passive that prevents you from being knocked down. This means you can literally shoot explosive weapons right in front of your face and you're not going to be knocked back, which is really convenient. And if you'd also like to know how to build Baruch and Ash after their respective reworks, then I got you covered right here. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Zell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nostalix Gaming, Turtlepeer, Lycon Shepherd, Anakanio2, Pepperwolf, Mihawky, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.